Today's story takes place in one of the most notorious cities in the Deep South, the city of Mobile in the state of Alabama. Mobile is known for its key location as the only major city in Alabama with sea access. Therefore, it also has the state's only saltwater port, allowing large ships to enter. Moreover, after an annexation of several communities, which pushed the city's population past 200,000, Mobile is now the second largest city in Alabama after Huntsville, now passing Birmingham and Montgomery. And Mobile is known for its rich history, actually being the oldest city in Alabama, and according to some, it's even the location of the oldest Mardi Gras carnival celebration in America, which allegedly even predates the New Orleans Party Fest. The city, which is now known as Mobile, was founded in 1702 as the first capital of the French Louisiana, and it was then also part of the colonies of Great Britain and Spain before eventually becoming part of Alabama as it became the 22nd state of the United States in 1819. But Alabama, including Mobile, also has a much darker history that is haunted by the shadow of the brutal slave trade. By 1840, Alabama had become the largest cotton producer in America using African American slave labor, and as the only port town in Alabama, Mobile became the second largest in cotton exporters just after New Orleans, as well as being at one point the home to the largest slave market in the entire Deep South. By the 1860s, almost half of the population of Alabama were slaves, and slave plantations formed the core of Alabama's economy. Even after the US banned the importation of new slaves in 1808, slave ships from the Old World would continue to smuggle in new slaves from Africa through Mobile, and in 1860, the last known international slave ship to America, called Clotilda, arrived in Mobile, smuggling 110 slaves from Africa. This also included the last known living survivors of the transatlantic slave trade in America, Cudjoe Lewis, Sally Smith, real name Rodoshi, and Matilda McCreer, who was actually the last slave to pass away in 1940. After having been freed at the end of the Civil War, about 30 of the former slaves bought by Clotilda, led by Cudjoe Lewis, established a community about 3 miles north of downtown Mobile, which became known as Africatown, which by the 1950s had grown into a 13,000 strong community with numerous black-owned businesses. But unfortunately, the oppression of African Americans didn't end after the Civil War, and by the early 20th century, Alabama had entered the Jim Crow era, where it saw the rise of legal segregation, such as segregated trains and a ban on interracial marriages. In fact, Alabama was the last state to officially repeal the law banning interracial marriage, which shockingly happened only in the year 2000, decades after the Supreme Court had effectively outlawed such bans federally. Even in 2000, only about 59% of the voters would even choose to repeal the ban, meaning that a whopping 40% still voted to keep these segregation laws in the year 2000, which probably says a lot about the community living there, a stark reminder of the racial tensions that remain in this state to this very day. Moreover, much of the segregation in Alabama was not codified in law, but simply customs that everybody in the area knew to follow or face severe consequences.
But predominantly what Jim Crow would have been would be a system of customs. So it didn't need to be encoded in laws for everyone who lived there locally to understand what was acceptable and what wasn't in terms of the racial order. And that racial order actually differed quite a bit in terms of what was acceptable and what wasn't from place to place. And the more regimented that was in terms of culture and custom, actually the fewer laws that you would see. Mississippi and Alabama actually have fewer formal Jim Crow laws than many of the states in the Upper South, in part because it was just so clear to everyone in these communities that this was a fixed order and you didn't need laws to actually put that into place.
Segregation was also the law of the land in Mobile, where even many public spaces like parks were often reserved for white people only, despite the fact that almost half of the population was black at this point. Moreover, predominantly black communities like Africatown were commonly left out of Mobile's infrastructure plans, causing severe health issues, which were later further escalated by the building of large factories that emitted dangerous pollutants into this community. The Africatown community would later be split into various neighborhoods. The ones still being left today are known as Plateau, Magazine, Happy Hills, Kelly Hills, and Lewis Quarters. And unfortunately, these communities are still fighting with the same pollution and health issues that plagued them decades before. During the Second World War, the economy in Mobile was actually booming due to the Navy's shipyards being established along the Mobile Bay. This was a positive development for the town's repressed black population, as there were thousands of free black men and women that were gaining honest employment in these shipyards. President Roosevelt would even sign an executive order prohibiting discrimination in the defense industry, which finally allowed black employees to advance their careers properly. Unfortunately, this would cause many of the white employees to become envious of the black people who were now competing for the same jobs as them, and this would eventually cause huge racial riots as white men would begin violently attacking the minority black employees. Later, during the Civil Rights rights movement in the 1960s, Alabama would see the rise of one of the most violent Ku Klux Klan organizations of its time, the United Klans of America, whose members carried out numerous violent attacks in Alabama, such as the so-called 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham in 1963 that ended up killing 4 young black girls. In recent decades, Mobile, like the rest of Alabama, has struggled with relatively high levels of poverty, with the state commonly being amongst the 10 poorest in the nation. And this poverty has affected the black population there particularly, who despite being the clear majority in the city of Mobile, on average are earning by far the least compared to their counterparts of different races. And with high levels of poverty and marginalization, naturally, high crime rates would often follow, and Alabama is no exception to this. For example, the state has ranked amongst the highest in gun violence statistics for years now, and Alabama also had an alarming increase in stats, like the prison homicide rate during the 2010s. And within Alabama, Mobile has the second highest crime rate after Birmingham. In 2023, Forbes would even report that Mobile was the second most dangerous city in the entirety of America. However, this would actually turn out to be based on completely faulty data, with the FBI later backtracking. But anyway, this doesn't change the fact that violent crime, particularly gang-related crime, is a major problem in Mobile.
News 5 investigates Mobile's gang problem and what the city is doing to fight it. Just yesterday, we told you how prosecutors believe the shooting death of 15-year-old Anissa Baker at the Grand Hall was the result of a gang rivalry.
Tonight, we turn our attention once again to the violence in our community. 2 arrests have been made for last night's deadly shooting in Pritchard. Both suspects have been charged with murder.
As they go to get in the car, he reacts to someone across the street and begins firing. As the two exchange gunfire, his friends hit the pavement. It appears as though he's dodging bullets while firing at least 7 shots.
6 people in Mobile have been indicted by a federal grand jury charged with conspiracy to commit murder for hire.
A wild and crazy scene Friday night at a Chevron on Spring Hill Avenue. It all started around 8:30 when you see this woman get out of her car holding a gun and walk over to this burgundy car. She tries talking to someone in the back seat, but the driver starts pulling off. As the car swerves out of the parking lot, you see gunfire coming from the car. If you look closely, you can see where at least 3 bullets hit the concrete, one of them hitting the woman, who starts shooting back before running to her car and speeding off. Customers dropping to the ground, some running inside for cover.
Mobile Police Detective Glenn Barton says the genesis of the March 18th double homicide was an ongoing war between a gang known as 2K Babies, or 2KB, and the South End gang. Cortland Parker, the detective says, was the leader of the 2KB gang and was upset over the killing of his cousin, and a taunting rap video posted online 7 days later.
Well, it has been a violent 72 hours in Mobile. 17 shootings, 1 stabbing, and a strangulation.
The sheriff's office says this all started last Tuesday near Dauphin Island Parkway and Military Road when a sheriff's deputy spotted a vehicle matching the description of a kidnapping suspect speeding down towards Johns Lane.
Kevin Levy with Mobile Police says there's an alarming trend of children getting involved in gang activity in the city.
What's alarming is the age of the people the young youth who choose to participate. And what happens is you sort of get the snowball effect, right?
And interestingly, considering the uphill battle that African Americans have faced in this historically oppressive state, when it comes to the rap music that young people growing up in Alabama were making to express their experience in the state, the young rappers coming out of Alabama would ultimately struggle to gain relevance in the wider music scene, with some of the very early examples being the late 90s rapper Drama with his song Left Right Left gaining some national momentum, and into the late noughties, rapper Rich Boy would have a hit song with his track Throw Some D's, blowing up in 2007, around the peak of the so-called Dirty South era, which would later become known as the Dirty Decade. A period in rap history spanning from the late 90s to the late 2000s that saw many rappers from the southern states other than Alabama, like Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Memphis, making a significant name for themselves. However, since the late 2000s, when Huntsville, Alabama-based rap collective Slow Motion Sounds and other associated Huntsville rappers like Jackie Chain and the Paper Route Gangsters were making waves in the underground, even getting remixes made by the most famous EDM producer in the world, Diplo. That would lead to artists in the early 2010s like the rapper Doe B from Montgomery, Alabama, gaining national traction before his untimely passing. Then there's also the rapper Yellow Wolf from Gadsden, Alabama, who signed to Eminem's Shady Records label. Now, rappers from Alabama have slowly started gaining more and more momentum, and there's now several people who have garnered considerable popularity coming out of the state in recent years, including names like Rilo Rodriguez, No Cap, Young Blue, Flo Milli, TLE Cinco, and Lil Rai, just to name a few. But ultimately, on the whole, the state has generally been suppressed and isn't really looked at as a hot breeding ground for music musical talent, but Honeycomb Brazy might just change that. Anyway, now you know a bit about the environment that shaped Honeycomb Brazy growing up, but to truly understand his story, we've got to also talk about his family and his brutal upbringing that saw him placed in gang-affiliated danger playing with firearms as young as age 13.